Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the first session of Day 2, News 9 Global Summit. Mr. Abbott, let me start by thanking you, first of all, for what I thought was a very honest and an accurate assessment of where India is today. Why don't we see more such honesty from more Western leaders?
Well, it's easier to be honest when you're retired. That's the sad truth. And probably being a bit too candid too often was one of the reasons why I was retired a little bit earlier than I would have liked.
So, no, but on a more serious note, if you look at the issue that we are facing with Canada as well, where there seems to be a total lack of appreciation of the problems, what India calls a problem, from a Canadian perspective, that extremists are allowed to operate from foreign soil and attack India, and some countries don't want to recognize that as a problem. So what would you say to such countries?
Well, if there were a nest of people operating in New Zealand, for argument's sake, who were determined to create mayhem and violence in Australia, we would be very keen as Australians to have the New Zealand government crack down on such individuals. And certainly I thought it was a mistake for the Australian government recently to readily permit entry into Australia of people from the United Kingdom and Canada who were known to be deeply subversive agitators, if you like, coming to Australia not for tourism, which we welcome, but for politics, which frankly we would rather not have amongst people claiming to be tourists. So I think a government such as Australia's and the Friends of India more generally need to be careful about allowing things to happen in their countries which make it needlessly difficult for the Indian government here at home. That said, obviously it is important for the Indian government here at home to be decent, respectful, to appreciate that in a democracy there will be dissent, that people are entitled to argue for a better chance and a fairer go for different parts of the country and so on. But it's one thing to say that the central government might not have been as sympathetic as it should have been to places X or Y. It's another thing to want to create violence and indeed secessionism inside the country.
Right. Now, I want to ask you a personal question, Mr. Abbott. You've known our Prime Minister, Mr. Modi, rather intimately over the last 10 years, and you have described him as a transformative leader. So when you've been a Prime Minister yourself, you're a global statesman. So what do you think makes him a transformative leader? How is he different from other global leaders that you interact with?
Well, there's probably three things, I suppose, about Prime Minister Modi. One, extremely unusual. One, unusual in an Indian context. And one, I would say, necessary for any effective leadership. The extremely unusual thing about Prime Minister Modi is that as a young man, he was sufficiently spiritually minded to spend at least a year as a virtual monk in the Himalayas. Now, as someone who spent 3 years in a seminary myself, before realising that I was a square peg in a round hole, I appreciate someone who gets that the world is not just the here and now. It's not just all about money and materialism. And I think that adds a dimension to Prime Minister Modi which is rare and that people can sense. And I think the inspirational quality that he brings ties back to that. The other thing about Prime Minister Modi is that he is in no sense an establishment figure. He doesn't come from an established business or political dynasty. And at least in the early days, he had no links with any such things. And given that for a long time, India was dominated by the Congress, which tended to be very much the establishment, I think in that sense, Prime Minister Modi has been a people's voice in a way that a lot of national politicians haven't always been. The third thing is that he's had an agenda. He has wanted India to be less of a bystander and more of an actor on the global stage. He has wanted the Indian economy to be more efficient. He has wanted the ordinary lives of Indians to be better. I mean, the drive to electrify the couple of 100 million Indians, to electrify the lives of the couple of 100 million Indians who had no access to reliable power. They're transformative, completely transformative. I mean, the drive to extend proper sanitation to hundreds of millions of people. I mean, I can remember what India was like 40 years ago in terms of sanitation. And okay, it's not a big deal geopolitically, but by God, it makes a difference. So I think he's had a very strong domestic agenda. Help people's lives in practical ways, strengthen the country in practical ways through infrastructure and so on, and as best you can, given the fact that you can't push the envelope too far, try to liberalise and reform the economy.
Right. So you touched upon in your speech how India is now emerging as a leader of the global south. But when we look around the world, there's still a lot of reluctance among, especially the developed nations, the Western nations, to admit that there might be a larger role for India in that sort of a scenario. Why do you think the world is still not ready to accept that India is actually the default leader for global south?
Look, the global south is not a term I particularly like or use myself. I mean, the global south seems to be shorthand for countries that feel they haven't always got a fair go. Now, I accept that in many cases that's the case. But personally, I would rather be involved in a leadership role in a community of values rather than simply a community of disadvantage or perceived victimhood. And I don't think the developed world, in inverted commas, is at all reluctant to see India in a leading role. The Quad is a classic example of three developed countries' eagerness to see India taking a leadership role. And I know this might be hard to credit, and I know it's not something that America is always very good at in practice, but I think at least in principle, the Americans understand that the Quad will only work if India is at least as much its leader as the United States. Right. This is not an American-led partnership. This is a partnership of equals, at least where India and America are concerned. Right. And if the Americans forget that, the Quad won't work.
Right. You touched upon China in your speech, Mr. Abbott. I want to ask you a very straight question. How real is a scenario where China actually attacks Taiwan and tries to take over the country?
A government which ultimately is based on fear cannot afford to make threats that it doesn't carry out. And the Beijing regime routinely threatens to take Taiwan by force if necessary, and routinely promises its own people that it will be the global hegemon by mid-century. I think there's no doubt that China would have moved on Taiwan years ago if it thought it could get away with it. Obviously, until quite recently, there was no real match between China and America militarily. Today, there are enormous questions over whether the American Navy could operate in the Western Pacific without suffering massive losses in a full-scale conflict with China. That means that China's ability to take Taiwan is growing by the day. Now, I don't think China wants war. I think that China wants to win without war. That's the classic, the art of war, is it not? To win without fighting. So I think that's what China would prefer. But let's not be under any misapprehension. The thing that drives the Chinese leadership every moment of every day, other than their preservation in power, is to overcome the century of humiliation and having snuffed out the practical freedom of Hong Kong in violation of the treaty that they signed, they are now absolutely focused on taking Taiwan as quickly as they can, if possible, without a fight. But every day there is grey zone warfare going on against Taiwan. Every day there is military belligerence being practiced against Taiwan. And if they think the rest of the world, particularly the United States, is sufficiently distracted by other things, if they think that perhaps their own position is becoming fragile and needs to be shored up by a foreign adventure, that is when I think we are at a point of maximum danger.
Right. So, Mr. Abbott, we already have two regional conflicts happening. One, Russia, Ukraine, then between Israel and Palestine. Is the world maybe just a badly aimed nuclear tactical missile away from a nuclear war? I mean, how grave is a global conflict likely, to your mind? How do you rate the chances of a global conflagration?
Look, I hate talking about this because the Great War was horrific. The Second World War was even worse. And a new global conflict would be by several orders of magnitude worse than anything we've ever seen before. I mean, the statement of Einstein, I don't know how the next war will be fought, but the one after that will be fought with sticks and stones. I mean, I think there is much in that depressing observation. So I think we've got to do everything we humanly can to avoid it. But weakness is not the way to avoid the next conflict. Weakness is provocative. The only way to keep the peace is to maintain deterrence. And that doesn't mean being crazy brave, but it certainly means being strong enough to let any substantial aggressor know that aggression will not pay because the price is just too high. Now, to go to the Ukraine, if Ukraine is not supported, at least at the level that it has been up till now, Putin will win because of the disparity of size. And if Putin wins in Ukraine, there will be a new Iron Curtain. At the very least, there will be a new Iron Curtain in Eastern Europe and a new arms race in that important part of the world. And that's assuming that having taken Ukraine, he won't then go for the other parts of Greater Russia, of formerly Greater Russia, that he thinks rightly belong to Mother Russia. Right. And then in the Middle East, well, look, I'm not saying that Hamas acted at the instructions of Tehran, but Hamas is a creature of Tehran, just as Hezbollah is a creature of Tehran. And Tehran is completely committed to the obliteration of Israel, and the Israelis, understandably, are completely committed to their survival. And there is substantial risk of escalation. And I guess the difference between the militarist Putin on the one hand, the communist commissars in Beijing on the other hand, and the apocalyptic Islamists is that at least Putin and Xi are broadly rational, whereas the apocalyptic Islamists are not rational in any meaningful sense. They believe that death in the pursuit of jihad is not something to be risked but avoided if possible. They think this is, in a sense, the culmination of life on Earth.
One final question, because our time's already up, Mr. Abbott. When we talk about the Indo-Pacific region and reframing the relationships there, I think the elephant in the room clearly is China. By all indications, China's economy is going to be in some sort of a slump, at least for the next 5 years. Do you think that's going to lead to some sort of a re-engineering of its own political system? Is it going to have any impact at all? Will the communist grip loosen? What do you think will happen to China, let's say, in the 5 years if the economy doesn't do well?
Well, I think the implicit deal that the communists have offered the Chinese people is you surrender your freedom to us and we will give you wealth. And this is why Taiwan is such a problem, because Taiwan shows that Chinese people can be both rich and free, indeed richer in Taiwan than they are in mainland China itself. So any significant slowdown in the Chinese economy is obviously going to threaten such legitimacy that the commissars have. And this is why I think an economically fragile China is more dangerous than an economically successful China, because dictatorships tend to look for a foreign adventure when they need to rally the people and distract the people, if you like, from their own domestic failings. So, yes, it does look like the Chinese economy is in a degree of trouble. Really not surprising, given that the market freedom that was significantly allowed in the post-Deng Xiaoping era has now been dramatically scaled back. Not surprising that the Chinese economy is in trouble. But rather than have them focus more domestically, it could actually drive a bit of adventurism abroad, which would be extremely problematic and dangerous for all of us.
Right. Mr. Abbott, we have completely run out of time, but I really appreciate the candor and the thoughtfulness that you brought to this conversation. Ladies and gentlemen, let's give Mr. Abbott a big round of applause.